Immediately seizing central space, this pawn advance dictates the game's initial dynamics, opening diagonals for rapid development. Instantly mirrors white's ambition, vying for central dominance and an open path for its queen and king's bishop. Developing a piece to attack the central pawn, preparing for castling, and subtly increasing pressure on e5. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move reinforces the central pawn and prepares for queenside development, setting a solid foundation for piece interplay. Opening a diagonal with immediate pressure on black's central pawn, setting the stage for potential tactical skirmishes. Challenging the bishop's placement, this pawn advance forces a decision, potentially gaining space or weakening the queenside pawn structure. Preserving the bishop's diagonal ensures continued pressure on black's queenside pawns and maintains flexibility in the center. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop towards the kingside offers a flexible pawn structure for black. Solidifying the center and preparing a d4 pawn push, this move aims for queenside space and pawn structure integrity. Developing the bishop to a defensive square prepares to recapture a pawn and reinforces the queenside structure. Asserting central dominion, this thrust immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to seize the initiative by creating immediate spatial pressure and potential pawn weaknesses on black's queenside. Initiating a fianchetto with g6 immediately addresses black's central pawn structure, aiming to fortify the kingside and potentially challenge white's central presence. This decision sacrifices immediate development of a knight or bishop for a long-term positional advantage, creating a powerful dark-squared bishop that will exert influence across the board. It signals an intention to castle kingside rapidly, seeking safety for the monarch. Castling here is a fundamental necessity, securing the king's safety on the kingside and activating the rook, which is vital for future central control and potential pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to its best square sets up a harmonious piece structure, anticipating the eventual pawn push to f5 and freeing the queen for potential central operations, all while keeping the king relatively secure behind a pawn wall. 8. d5 forcefully seizes central space, aiming to cramp black's pieces and prepare a kingside attack by pushing pawns further. This advance transforms the game into a more closed, strategic struggle where careful piece maneuvering and pawn breaks will be paramount. White sacrifices some immediate piece activity for long-term structural advantages and restriction of black's counterplay. The knight's retreat to e7 offers defensive solidity by reinforcing the center and preparing for kingside castling, while also potentially rerouting to f5 or g6 to contest the d5 outpost. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines for your attack on the kingside and creates an isolated pawn for black, a classic target to exploit. Reclaiming the central pawn with the queen, black embraces a solid structure, but it surrenders immediate counterplay and leaves the king a tad exposed to potential long-term queenside pressure. Asserting control over the d5 square, white aims to solidify their central pawn structure and restrict black's piece mobility, particularly the knight on e7. The immediate challenge for black will be to find active squares for their pieces, as white's central pawns now create a formidable barrier. Reinforcing the king's safety by creating a defensive pawn shield, this maneuver prepares for potential knight maneuvers or simply discourages any immediate kingside assaults, offering a subtle but important psychological advantage by establishing a firm defensive perimeter. Asserting central influence while developing another piece, this maneuver aims to bolster the d4 pawn and prepare for potential pawn pushes later, while also freeing up the c-pawn for future flexibility. Unleashing the pawn chain's potential requires careful handling, and this pawn thrust aggressively challenges white's central occupation, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and create a dynamic imbalance. Unleashing a pawn storm, white dramatically opens lines, inviting tactical skirmishes and disrupting black's pawn structure. This pawn capture aggressively contests central space and seeks to unravel black's position, potentially creating weaknesses around the king. By initiating exchanges on the king's side, white aims to simplify the game, hoping to leverage piece activity in the ensuing, potentially sharper middle game. The removal of black's advanced pawn may grant white greater influence over the center and open diagonals for their bishops. This bold pawn thrust could be the prelude to a dynamic attacking sequence, exploiting the king's potentially exposed status. Opening up the g-file creates immediate pressure on white's kingside, offering a promising pawn structure for black in exchange for the slightly compromised king's safety. Venturing the knight to the edge often signals a potential kingside attack, aiming to leverage the open g-file and pressure the weakened kingside pawn structure, though it does leave a square vulnerable for black to exploit. Shifting the knight to the kingside flank aims to bolster defense and prepare for potential counterplay on the h-file, subtly influencing the pawn structure's stability. Unleashing a bold pawn storm, white immediately challenges the center and aims to pry open lines for his pieces, creating immediate tactical complications. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust to seize central territory, this move dynamically challenges white's knight and opens new avenues for black's pieces, while simultaneously creating a forward outpost that may prove difficult for white to dislodge. Shifting the bishop to the active e3, square immediately aims to develop this piece harmoniously and prepare for further queenside expansion or support a potential kingside assault, all while eyeing the newly created e4 outpost for black's pawn. A bold decision to secure the king, but it opens avenues for white's pieces. The immediate consequence of castling is creating a sanctuary for the monarch behind a pawn shield. However, this action also solidifies black's pawn structure on the kingside, which, while seemingly protective, can become a potential weakness if white manages to exploit the g7 square or create pressure along the open files. Notice how white's knight on h4, though currently out of play, is poised to jump into the fray on f5 or g6 if given the opportunity. The cramped nature of black's queenside, with pieces still undeveloped, presents a strategic imbalance that white will likely aim to exploit. Consider the potential for white to bring their rook to the c-file, creating long-term pressure. Controlling the kingside space and preparing for a potential pawn storm advance, this move aims to secure the pawn structure and prevent black's pieces from gaining too much central influence, while also offering a subtle retreat square for the knight if necessary. Opening up the c-file offers a direct challenge to white's central pawn structure, potentially creating counterplay, but also introducing significant structural weaknesses for black. Discarding a pawn to achieve open lines for immediate piece activity, white initiates a dynamic shift, challenging black's central pawn chain and aiming to exploit the newly created semi-open d-file for their rooks. Opening the b-file now dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a potential pathway for black's rook while simultaneously granting white control over the newly freed c5 square. This trade of pawn structure for open lines represents a significant positional gamble, emphasizing active piece play over static pawn formations. The queen's repositioning to e2 aims to support the central pawn push, potentially liberating the knight on c3 and preparing for a more active role on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the e4 outpost. Exploring a dynamic shift, black introduces the queen to a central outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially unblock the d-file for future operations, while simultaneously eyeing weaknesses around white's kingside. Radicalizing the central tension by placing a rook on the open d-file, this repositioning aims to escalate pressure against black's somewhat exposed king, potentially exploiting the weakened kingside pawn structure which black has inadvertently created. Seeking refuge on a less exposed square, the black king relocates to h7, a common defensive maneuver in this type of pawn structure. This repositioning offers a slight respite from any immediate central threats and potentially prepares for a later kingside escape route if necessary, though it does expose the h-file. Securing the monarch's safety feels paramount. Repositioning the king to the relative quiet of h2 offers it a shield from potential diagonal threats and clears the g-file for defensive maneuvers or future rook activity. The rook finds its way to the open g-file, a bold statement of intent that immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to exploit the potential weaknesses around white's king. Initiating a central rook maneuver, white signals an intent to activate the rook on the d-file, potentially targeting black's weakened kingside pawn structure and preparing for a deeper penetration into enemy territory. Shifting the knight to e8, a seemingly passive retreat, cleverly prepares to reroute it to g7, reinforcing the kingside and potentially challenging white's central influence. Preparing to unfurl the kingside by advancing the g-pawn directly addresses the constricted position of white's king and opens a potential escape square, while simultaneously contesting the crucial g-file, a maneuver that could prove vital in future exchanges and potential defensive efforts. Unlocking the queenside, this pawn advance aims to create counterplay by challenging white's centralized structure and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Sharpening the pressure along the d-file, white readies a potential pawn storm or piece infiltration, while black scrambles to establish a cohesive defensive structure amidst white's centralized control. Reasserting central influence, black endeavors to challenge white's established pawn chain and open attacking avenues for the knight. Rerouting the knight to the kingside via the center aims to reinforce the pawn chain and potentially target the weakened dark squares around black's castled king. The rook's excursion to the b-file initiates a subtle bid for counterplay along the open corridor, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the flank. Deploying the bishop to d4 intends to contest the d-file, a crucial artery in the center, and simultaneously prepares for a potential pawn push on the queenside, aiming to expand white's influence. Relocating the rook to the 7th rank aims to create pressure on white's queenside pawns and potentially exploit the open b-file later, though it also temporarily passive and might invite further queenside expansion from white. Unleashing a pawn storm, white seeks to destabilize black's kingside and create new avenues of attack, a bold gambit in a position that has seen much maneuvering. Redirecting the rook to the 7th rank initiates a bold counter-strategy, aiming to pry open the kingside and leverage the newly created space for offensive potential against white's somewhat exposed monarch. This strategic pawn sacrifice unlocks a powerful bishop diagonal and creates an immediate threat on the kingside by clearing the path for the rook to potentially swing over to the h-file. Reclaiming the darkened g-file, the rook now stands ready to contest the central squares, a dynamic counterpoint to white's king-side buildup. A bold repositioning of the rook, preparing to contest the vital d-file and simultaneously creating a menacing potential battery with the queen along the 4th rank, while also subtly improving the defender's kingside evacuation options. Sacrificing the pawn opens the g-file, a bold gambit to try and pry open white's kingside defenses, hoping to disrupt the harmonious coordination of black's pieces and exploit any lingering king exposure before white can solidify their pawn structure. An immediate recapture, this queen sortie seeks to exploit the suddenly open diagonals and lines created by black's pawn push, aiming to disrupt the opponent's nascent attacking formation and potentially create immediate threats against the weakened king's vicinity. Unleashing the knight from its passive position, this maneuver seeks to activate the piece and potentially create threats against white's king, though it also opens up possibilities for white's pieces to exploit the now undefended e4 square. The queen exchange simplifies the position considerably, and for white, it's a move that aims to reduce black's attacking potential while creating some open files that might become useful later. By taking the black queen, white is essentially saying, I don't want to deal with that piece anymore in this chaotic middle game, and I'm happy to simplify. It also opens up the possibility of developing the rook on d4 more effectively, and perhaps eventually targeting the weak pawn on e4. A brilliant forcing sequence unfolds, exposing the white king's vulnerabilities as the knight leaps into a devastating check, disrupting white's defensive structure and creating immediate tactical threats. Shielding the monarch from the immediate discoverable threat of the knight's fork is paramount, even at the cost of compromising pawn structure on the king side. Opening up the e-file presents a new attacking avenue for your rook, but it also risks exposing your king's defenses as the knight on f3 is no longer shielded. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, White aims to exploit the exposed king and create immediate threats on the king side. Harnessing the unleashed power of the knight, Black boldly seeks to exploit the open files and pressure the weakened white king, aiming to create immediate tactical complications. Liberating the rook to activate it on the third rank offers immediate counterplay, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed king's diagonal. Seizing the open file with the rook, a decisive thrust to disrupt White's coordination and exploit the lingering weakness around the f-pawn. Exploiting the open file, this rook exchange immediately targets the weakened back rank, aiming to dismantle Black's defensive structure by eliminating a key defender. A bold gambit, plunging the rook deep into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially trap the king if it ventures out too soon. Unleashing the knight to f4 immediately creates a powerful threat against Black's disorganized pieces, particularly targeting the weak pawn on g3 and potentially opening lines towards the king. The pawn structure has been dramatically altered, and now this rook sacrifice opens up the g-file, directly threatening the vulnerable white king nestled on h. Navigating this complex liquidation, the knight's repositioning towards the king side signals an intention to shore up defenses and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses in Black's now exposed monarch, even as the pawn structure fragments. Sacrificing the rook here ignites a wild, unbalanced position, shifting the game into a chaotic tactical melee where the exposed white king suddenly becomes a primary target. Securing the king is paramount as the material thins, with the monarch finding a safer haven. Seizing the open file with the rook initiates a fierce counterattack, aiming to disrupt White's recently consolidated position and create immediate threats against the vulnerable king. Seizing the now open file, the rook aggressively infiltrates the enemy camp, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially create a decisive passed pawn. The initiative shifts dramatically as the knight, surprisingly, dives deep into enemy territory, creating a powerful battery on the open file and forcing a significant concession from White's king's protective pawn structure. Unleashing a desperate attack on White's beleaguered king, Black hopes to exploit the exposed white monarch's precarious position. Unleashing a sudden check from the rook across the diagonal, Black capitalizes on White's compromised king position, following the knight's misplaced sortie. The king's sudden exposure now becomes the paramount concern. A desperate king, exposed on the king side after that pawn sacrifice, now faces a swift and direct royal assault. The monarch now awkwardly scrambles to the side, having abandoned its central stronghold. It desperately needs protection from the relentless cavalry advancing down the open highway. Disrupting White's already shaky king position, this check forces another shuffling retreat for the monarch, highlighting the lingering danger from the rook now poised on the open file. King escape routes are crucial, and 42. Key 4 boldly plunges the monarch into the fray, aiming to untangle the white pieces and exploit the open files, while simultaneously threatening to advance the pawn and create new tactical possibilities. The king, now exposed on the light squares, finds little solace as the rook invades his personal space, a testament to the lingering dangers after the queen's departure.